Welcome back. You're listening to the panel discussion, Closing the Gap Between Government and IT, sponsored by Ironbow and Dell EMC on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests are Tom Cicella, the Director of the Army Architecture Integration Center in the Office of the CIO G6, Mark Googe, the Chief Technology Officer for the Military Health System, Manoj Thomas, the Cloud Client Computing Sales Specialist for Dell EMC, and Troy Massey, the Director of Enterprise Engagements for Ironbow. Now, right before break, Manoj, you were just jumping into the conversation. I had to cut you off, but jump in, because one of the things that you had heard from Tom was the challenge of offline. What do you do if you're on a VDI, if you're thin client and you need to work offline? Talk about those challenges.
Right, so first of all, when you're doing VDI and you want to go offline, there was really no good option in the past, right? You had to give somebody a laptop or whatever it is that they wanted. So now with VDI, there is an option that allows you to check out a virtual machine. And Tom mentioned it's an option. However, it adds a little bit more complexity. And that option is, I think, great. My opinion is great if you're using a BYOD kind of scenario, right? Then you can check out your corporate virtual machine onto your BYOD laptop. Off you go. You manage it completely from the network. But if it's a GFE device, well, now you're sort of managing two OSs, right? You may not necessarily need that, but for an offline scenario where you are on a plane or you're in some place where there's no access, there is capabilities within VDI where you can check out a virtual machine. Again, it's great for a BYOD environment, right? So even in that offline scenario, there are options. You have to also look at where are they going to be, what are they doing, GFE, BYOD, that kind of scenario. So,
and let me just be clear, when you say check out a virtual machine, meaning it becomes comes onto your device, so it becomes just something you can save to.
Absolutely, yeah. So it becomes a container within your operating system where you fire up the second operating system, which is delivered by corporate.
And
right?
then when you connect back to your servers,
it syncs up all the changes.
It syncs up and all the changes.
Right.
So is that the answer then to also the mobility question? Because let me turn to Mark. In the Military Health System, you guys are big into mobile. You have healthcare providers, doctors, nurses moving from patient to patient. Does this sound like a potential solution?
It's certainly a very viable solution for us. If you've watched any television shows and you see people in a hospital, they're usually not standing around, right? It's always about movement, right? So having that data empowerment to those individuals for their line of business or work as they go through something like grand rounds, right, to look at a patient's condition, to be able to reach back to the data they need to look at a course of action for that patient is incredibly meaningful for what we need to do for our patients. Again, and know the user population, and maybe walk in their smocks for a little bit to see what that means when we try to apply technology to them, is how do they use that, and then when they go home, the offline, usually the doctors and nurses and the healthcare professionals, when they leave a facility, their day does not end. Right? They are extending into their home life of that. So having that desktop or that experience with them connected back to the hospital for those patients entrusted to their care is very meaningful for them and allows us to do better business from healthcare to health.
Now, for someone like a doctor who goes home and wants to look at records or update something, they could do that through a VDI because the connection likely at home will have a broadband or something fast enough. But then again, if you're out in the middle of Iowa or Idaho or wherever, and maybe you don't have broadband, right, is that, then you guys are having to balance both of those needs.
Right. I think the trade space is that, right? Looking at the art of possibility about what their condition might be in to look at how you would supply that technology to them. And exactly when we're talking about downloading to, and we're in that shift we're just going back to a modified mainframe with more intelligence and enhancements and a prettier picture to it. But know that population. Not everybody, when we talked about green screens, utilizes that capability. So how do you look at some of those checklists or capabilities to deliver to them? And we want to keep it as free flowing as possible, because really if we standardize on it, I kind of don't care what they check out, right? They need to say that and self-provision what IT they need, and it's really all about the data and the data usage and the applications they need to help with their condition. If you do that, I think that's the good vanilla, that you're not always doing help desk calls, and it really reduces the back-end calls and what you can do to expand the life cycle of some of those infrastructure investments to their business, and look at what we do for when we move a third of the population around the globe every year.
Yep. Troy, you're shaking your head.
Yes, so I'd like to address that a little bit too, the benefits of VDI in today's world versus the traditional. We have a laptop and we travel around. People travel for weeks, months, whatever, they come back. First thing that has to happen with that laptop on a traditional environment, all of the updates. So you go ahead, you sync up, and then you go ahead and get coffee, because all your patches, your service fixes, everything is going to happen to your image while you wait. So with the VDI industry, we can check out like we discussed. We can check out that image, go do our work. All of our unique data that we did when we come back gets synced up. But while you are gone, the image that sits in the data center has already been patched, being tested to make sure everything's functional. It's all pretty good to go. So when you sync up, you already get that new image.
So the idea of syncing up, that's something we've heard about VDI. We go down a path of security, but before we go there, is the fact that you're all working off the same spot, so applications. Manoj, are you seeing as this is happening that agencies are understanding? You talked about ROI earlier. You talk about the benefits. Do people get that still, or is that still kind of out there? Like, yeah, I think we can do that.
No, they do, absolutely do, right? It's just trying to get them to adopt and how soon you want them to adopt, right? Everybody understands the benefits, the security benefits of it. And just to touch on mobility, just back up for a quick second. So when my job sort of is, when someone says mobility, I want to dig in a little bit, right? So there's two classes of it. Is it BYOD? When you say mobility, it's just, I just want to get access to it as long as I have connectivity. Or are your users traveling, like you said, you're in Idaho or you're in overseas somewhere with no connectivity. So we always try to say, okay, when we look at your user base, let's look at them exactly what they're doing and what they need to do and when they need to do it, right? So that's the way you can best deliver that experience, or give them a device that they can work when they're online or offline. But back to your stuff, they absolutely see the security benefits. They all see it, right? But what I sort of see standing in the way is business as usual, right? Try to get them off of that and the time it takes to test the applications. So that's where I see the delay is. Everybody sees the value in it, and you guys are already doing this stuff. And I can tell you, pretty much every agency in the government has some level of VDI that they're either using or have tried, right? So it's just a matter of educating them and bringing them back into full force. Right?
Tom, this is a great segue around to the beginning of the conversation when you talked about the Fort Gordon. I want to come back to that, the Cybersecurity Center, if I get that right.
Center of Excellence.
Center of Excellence. Talk a little bit about, you talked about the future, if you will, how potentially the base of the future, the command of the future. Right. How does this kind of relate back to this discussion, mobile and VDI and the like?
Right, so one of the things we're trying to push the envelope with a little bit at Fort Gordon is, although for the Army it is a Cyber Center of Excellence, Fort Gordon is an installation, what we're calling the installation of the future. So across the gamut, think of anything you can think of from an IT stack, all the way from the lowest physical layer up to the highest layer. We want to implement technologies that'll take us into the future. And so we talked about virtualization earlier more from a data center perspective, but one of the things we're really actively kind of looking at is application virtualization. And Manoj mentioned this actually, and Mark did as well, right? So if we can stream the application to the user rather than install it as part of the image, it does a number of things for us. First off, we can keep the application up to date more readily, right? And industry term is called evergreen, right? So, but it also allows us to decrease the size of the image. It decreases the amount of memory the image takes, the amount of computing horsepower it takes, right? And you couple that with emerging networking technologies, the industry buzz term, software-defined networking, right? And you push that into the data center, known as software-defined data centers and whatnot. Really, what we're talking about is virtualizing from the physical layer all the way up, right? So you virtualize the network. There's no more physical network ports. You plug a machine. An example being one of the other military departments went to Best Buy. They had an infrastructure called Comply to Connect, and went to Best Buy, bought a laptop, plugged into their computer network. It identified the fact that it wasn't a compliant computer. It re-imaged the entire machine, put their baseline down, and pushed all the applications to it in under an hour. And so that shows you the power of some of the technology that can be deployed, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at for Fort Gordon writ large and the Cyber Center of Excellence, because it is the Cyber Center of Excellence. I almost wanted to say the next battlefield, but it's not next anymore, right? Is the cyber world, right? And so we need to be able to have an environment where we can train our soldiers in an environment where the war is happening, right? And it's no longer about sending them out in the field and traditionally what I call kinetic targeting, right? Blowing things up, right? It's a non-kinetic activity, whether it's offensive or defensive cyber operations. So these attack the control plane of software-defined networks, right? Attack the data center, insider threat. These are all things, user behavior monitoring, that we need to be able to set up and evaluate very quickly and say, oh, our adversary has adapted to this particular technique that we're using from a defensive perspective. How do we either plug the hole or go offensive on them, if it opens up such an avenue? And so, simple things, enabling technologies, and we do, in CIOG 6, we're more of a policy organization, but IT is an enabler for the mission, whatever the mission might be, whether it's medical, war fighting, just the business side, financial management, for example, right? But wireless technology enabling mobility, ubiquitous wireless broadband connection across the installation is something we're looking at. Using line of sight to connect buildings as either a primary or a backup to fiber cuts, right? Which because they never happen. So things like that, creating the survivability and the resiliency and baking it into the core infrastructure so that the users are in the application space, in the mission space where they need to be, right? And not worrying about, oh, am I online or am I offline, right? So we did this in the Pentagon, right? I just experienced this yesterday. I got up from my desk with my phone, and we have Wi-Fi, right? And it followed me around. I was able to have connectivity throughout the building, which 12 months or so ago
could not do.
Couldn't even get a cell signal, and ironically it was on Wi-Fi and I had no cell signal, so that's good. But so that's kind of what we're looking for is soldier as a sensor sort of thing. How can we leverage this? And then we won't open the door, but this leads us into the kind of the big data, cyber analysis, business analytics space, where virtualization can help us as well. So
Mark, you heard what Tom talk about the installation of the future. Are you guys looking at something in the same realm? Maybe not installation of the future, but as we talk about virtualization and SDN and all those other popular topics.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So working with our facilities department and our MILCOM planning, we absolutely are creating, right, acoustically tuned rooms that allows for, right, patient engagement, provider engagement, to take that data about my husband or wife or in a cardiac care. What should I know as a spouse to take care of that? What do I need to do when we have, let's say, a surge of wounded warriors in our facility, right, that their family can allow that ecosystem to happen, our guest wireless network, while still protecting. Those things are critical to what we want to do for shaping the hospital of the future and learning from some of the industry partners who have built some of those hospitals of the future, right? I mean, you could imagine just turning a room 15 degrees would reduce the ambient noise inside that, right? So you're in a hospital, but you don't always rest in a hospital, right? So how can we work on just tuning that and quieting some of the monitoring? Allow our doctors to walk around with what we have for telephones on their things. I mean, it's really, we're at the point where we're Star Trek communicating. It really is. I mean, we have been in some of our overseas facilities, tried that out, and it's worked very well for where's the doctor out, and we can geolocate inside that facility where those providers are at. So if we had a code blue, or we have a disaster, or we have, my God, any kind of tragedy we have to go to, at least we know where our critical assets are, both right on the facility or not, to respond to those areas and activities. It's amazing. We've come a long way.
Mark's taking us down the IoT, IPv6. We got a whole different set of conversations here.
I never mentioned IPv6.
No, you didn't. we don't talk about that. We call it IoT now. Let me turn to Troy. When we talk about what you're, Tom and Mark, trying to do, and a lot of other agencies are trying to do, a big piece of this is that migration to Windows 10. That's not an easy migration. Talk a little bit about what they should keep in mind.
Absolutely. So, one of the challenges we mentioned was the hardware intensity that Windows 10 presents. But traditionally, we've seen migrations are a challenge anyway, just going from one physical desktop to another physical desktop, what we call physical to physical, because you have to migrate the entire user information over from one to one. Migration times are extremely long, extremely painful. All sorts of stuff that you don't even think about in the background, like you need more IP addresses because you have two machines plugged in at the same desk right now. You need to make sure you have network plugged into, you have two cables to that desktop everywhere you go. But the other part of that is the actual software portion. So moving physical to physical takes a long time, but when you have a virtual environment, the image gets created once for your entire user base. So the Army AGM, Army Goldmaster image gets created once. All those applications become virtualized applications on a on-prem, off-prem cloud. Is all tied together, and the deployment is simply the firing up of the new machine, or the old machine if it's capable in the VDI environment. Yeah.
So are you seeing that this idea of challenging migration to Windows 10? I mean, maybe should ask Tom this question. I mean, are you guys overcoming some of these obstacles? You talked about understanding that you got to touch the machines.
Right. So absolutely, we are, and we have overcome a good portion of them. Issues will forever come up, and what they might be. So we, as you mentioned earlier, unfortunately, the Department of Defense is a little bit behind the original intended plan date. But
we knew that was a stretch goal, anyways. I mean, Terry Halverson, the former DoD CIO, is known for his putting these stretch goals out there. So.
Right.
So with all due credit.
Yeah, so it was a stretch goal, and what we found out in the year that he gave us to do it is we took the year essentially to analyze the environment and figure out, where do we start, right? Yeah. So you got to look at your people, you got to look at your installation, the installations themselves, are they capable, right? There's actually a power, savings or an increase in HVAC requirements, these things. So we're now at the stage between a process of physically reloading the machines by touching them, remotely, kind of over the wire, re-imaging, and then what we're calling these upgrade in places, really starting to hit the picture. We call it the hockey stick picture, right? So it's going to start going up dramatically.
You had to bring up hockey sticks.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
bad timing.
Bad timing. Pittsburgh.
Exactly. So we're going to see a dramatic increase over the next couple of weeks and months, and we're targeting the January 2018 timeframe, and so far we believe we're tracking. Obviously Murphy always props his head up at most times, but we've been working on this now for a long time, and I think we've narrowed down a lot of the issues, and we actually made some investments in the actual infrastructure to facilitate this, and I don't like the word future-proof because that's in IT that's asking for Murphy to come and sit on your desk, right? But providing this infrastructure that will allow us to lead us into the future that is a little bit more malleable and a little bit more dynamic and resilient to changes in the ecosphere and changes in the environment. So.
All right, very good. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we will continue this conversation. You're listening to the panel discussion, Closing the Gap Between Government and IT, sponsored by Ironbow and Dell EMC on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.